It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. Your premier source for sports news and analysis in Oregon and Washington. Live on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
What is up? Welcome to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show, brought to you by the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. I am your host, Andy Patton. You can find me on Twitter at AndyPattonPNW, and you can find the Worldwide Sports Radio Network on Twitter as well at WWSRN_radio. Today is episode 3 of the show, and we have another really fun episode coming your way today. Brenna Greene, the sports director at KREM 2 in Spokane, is joining me in about a half an hour. Her and I are going to discuss CJ Ellaby, the newest, well, not even the newest, one of the newest Portland Trailblazers. He was selected in the second round, 46th overall by the Blazers from Washington State University. Brenna is going to be discussing CJ Ellaby and his style of play, who he is, what he could potentially bring to the Blazers. Her and I are also going to discuss Killian Tillie, the Gonzaga great, who unfortunately was not selected in the NBA draft, but did find a home with teaming up with former teammate Brandon Clark for the Memphis Grizzlies. We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss a whole ton of Gonzaga content. Looking forward to the season that is starting on Thanksgiving morning, 10:30 Pacific time. They are playing Kansas. It's going to be a blast. Way more fun than watching the Cowboys and the Lions lose, as I have been doing for most of my life. This is a much better thing to do. Last year, you may recall the Zags played Oregon on Thanksgiving in an overtime thriller. Super fun game. Hopefully we get more of the same this year. We're also going to discuss Washington State football and the Pac-12 in general. Unfortunately, Washington State is not going to be playing the University of Washington in the Apple Cup this weekend because of COVID-19 outbreaks. It's a first time this game won't be played since 1944, which obviously was for a very different reason. World War II was going on, so very sad to not see that game happen, but kind of something that we had to kind of expect might come down the line, unfortunately, with everything going on this year. So her and I got plenty to talk about, as you can probably tell. Before we get there, though, before she comes on the show, I am not going to lead off talking about the Seattle Seahawks like I normally do. I know that seems a bit counterintuitive considering they actually won the first time they've won a game since I started this show. I was starting to get worried that maybe I was a curse, but they won. They defeated the Arizona Cardinals 28-21. We got plenty to talk about with that game at the end of the show. Got to keep you all engaged somehow. I know many of you are Seahawks fans who are listening to this, but I have to open with my Portland Trailblazers. The shirt, I got to open with them. They revamped their entire roster starting at around this exact time 1 week ago. You may recall, if you were listening to episode 2, I had Brian Kalbrowski, the managing editor at Hoops Hype and USA Today's The Rookie Wire, on the show while we were discussing potential players the Blazers could select in the first round. He told me, hey, I think the Blazers just traded their first round pick. And sure enough, they traded Trevor Ariza, a first round pick, and then a 2021 first round pick for Robert Covington, former power forward from the Minnesota Timberwolves and Houston Rockets. But then they just kept making moves. They made so many other moves, and we have to open with that. So the first thing I want to talk about today is the Trailblazers got busy. General manager Neil Olshey did not want a repeat of last year when the team kind of peddled out, hey, look, we got Kent Bazemore. We signed the corpse of Pau Gasol, who didn't play a single second, and we signed Anthony Tolliver, who might as well have been a corpse. He did not look like an NBA player. They also acquired Mario Hezonja and just generally didn't put together a competitive enough roster to compete last year. They were banking on, I think, a massive role for Zach Collins as the starting power forward. And obviously he got hurt so early in the year, and things just really unraveled for the Blazers very quickly last year. Obviously they were able to sign Carmelo Anthony. We'll get to him in a little bit, but it didn't work out last year. And Neil Olshey and the Blazers staff clearly did not want that to happen again this season. So they got busy right away. We'll talk about Robert Covington first, but I'm just going to say, here's the ins and outs of what happened with the Blazers roster. as of last week, Robert Covington, Enes Kanter, Derek Jones Jr., Harry Giles, and CJ Ellaby. Back, Rodney Hood and Carmelo Anthony. And out, Mario Hezonja, Trevor Ariza, 2 first-round picks. That's it. Granted, Hassan Whiteside is almost certainly out as well, and I think you can probably put curtains on the era of Wenyen Gabriel and Caleb Swanigan in Portland as well. But beyond that, that is it. That's all the Blazers lost. Mario Hezonja, who was not a role player or not in the rotation by the end of the year, not really even at the start of the year, and Trevor Ariza, who granted played very well for the Blazers in the role that he had, but was, an older guy and got replaced by players, effectively was going to get replaced by Rodney Hood already, and then also got replaced by Robert Covington, who is just a younger, frankly, better version of him at this point in their careers. So let's kind of we'll talk about CJ Ellaby a little bit later when we have Brenna on the show, because she is an expert. She's covered Washington State basketball and football for a while. She spoke with CJ Ellaby shortly after the draft, so I know that she has some very, very good insight. So I'm excited to hear about that. But let's start with Robert Covington. So I talked about him a little bit last week. I kind of did a live impromptu reaction to Covington because, like I said, it happened in the middle of the show. So I didn't get to do a lot of digging into it. I didn't get to hear other people's kind of thoughts and impressions on the move. So now we're going to kind of get a chance to talk more about that. But effectively, my initial thoughts are more or less still how I feel. Robert Covington, exactly what this Portland team needed. He's a 3-and-D forward. The 3-point shot is a bit more questionable, but he's a solid defensive player. He can play the 3, 4, and the 5. I think for this team, he will be the starting power forward. I have very little doubt about that. I think that is his role this season. And he's a guy who, he averaged 12.5 points, 6.6 rebounds last year, split between the Timberwolves and the Houston Rockets. He's a very streaky shooter. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing to note about him. Last year, he shot 33% from downtown. He's had a couple of seasons where he shot 38, 39%. For the most part, he's been in that 34 to 36% range. So that's about average. So calling him a 3-and-D wing when he's really kind of an average 3-point shooter, I can understand why that may seem a bit disingenuous, but there's been a lot of research kind of in the advanced analytics kind of world of basketball about the 3-and-D and stretching the floor. And one of the main things that has kind of come out of this research is that to be impactful at spacing the floor, you don't necessarily need to make a lot of threes. You just need to shoot a lot of threes. And that may seem kind of silly, but effectively, when you think about it, opposing defenses know that NBA players can make threes. They know that Robert Covington can make threes. He's made a lot of threes in his career. He may not make them at a super elite clip, but he shoots 6.5 threes per game for his career. That's a lot. That's a lot of times that he's hacking up 3-pointers. And defenses know that. They know that Robert Covington is a threat to shoot. It doesn't necessarily matter how much of a threat he is to make said threes. It just matters that he is a threat to shoot. So adding him onto the roster, a guy who will hack up threes as soon as he has the opportunity to, I was going to say it doesn't quite matter what percentage he shoots. It matters a little. If 40 games into the year he's shooting 12% from 3, opposing defenses are probably going to let him sit. We saw that with Al-Farouq Aminu, for Blazers fans who remember, he started to get left wide open for games because he was just not a very good outside shooter, and defenses had to focus so much more on Dame and CJ and everybody else on that roster that they kind of said, well, we're going to leave Chief open. And I was specifically at a game against Boston where they did that. Brad Stevens and his staff said, we're just going to, Aminu's not a concern of ours. We're going to let him be. And he had a ton of open looks, and he scored like 28 points that game because he got hot, and that's what can happen. And that's why opposing defenses are not just going to say, well, Covington's shooting 32%, so we're just going to leave him, because he has the potential to shoot 7 for 11 in a game. And all of a sudden, he's got 33 points and the Blazers are beating you by 15 and Dame's only got 12. That's the kind of thing that can happen. So for Robert Covington, he's going to come in, he's going to stretch the floor. He's going to play that stretch 4 role, a spot that the Blazers just didn't really have anybody last year. Obviously, they brought Carmelo Anthony in, and he filled in very admirably. And we'll talk about his role a little bit later in the show. But I think Covington really is exactly what you want there. He's a little bit bigger. He's 6'9". He's got some size on him. He could play some very small ball 5, although I don't think the Blazers will really need him to, in part because of their other acquisition, Enes Kanter. But for Covington, I think he's locked in as the 4. He can slide up to 5 if they need him to. He can slide down to 3 if they want to play some very big lineups, which I don't think they'll do. But then again, I didn't think they'd start Zach Collins and Yusuf Nurkic at the same time, and they tried that last year, so maybe that'll be the case. And then the biggest thing for Covington is he's a good defensive player. The Blazers sorely lacked perimeter defense, specifically wing defense. I mean, all perimeter defense. Their guard defense is bad. Dame and CJ are not good defensive players. That's been the case forever. That's not going to change at this point in their career. That's just kind of something that the Blazers live with. And when you have poor guard defense, you really need good wing defense. And they didn't really have it last year. Rodney Hood obviously didn't play that much. He's not a very good defensive player, even when he does play. Mario Hezonja is a bad defensive player. Kent Bazemore was solid, but he obviously didn't last very long on the squad. And Carmelo Anthony is not a good defensive player. That's been a knock on him for the last 2 decades. It certainly didn't change last year. So to add a Robert Covington, a guy who can really lock down and play good defense, he can guard 2s, he can guard 3s, he can guard 4s. I think he could probably guard 5s, and I think it's reasonable to say he could guard some 1s. There's about a guy who can guard all 5 positions. He's going to be a good pick and roll defensive player, something that the Blazers really beat bad on last year was those pick and rolls. So that's something he'll be able to help them with. I love this move so much. Wings are so hard to acquire in the NBA. They cost so much, either financially or in terms of capital, either draft capital or trade capital. And that's what we saw here. Covington's not on a horrible contract, but he's not super cheap. And in order to acquire a player on a decent contract at that position, they also had to give up Trevor Ariza and 2 first-round picks. Now, again, that may be a lot to give up. But for the Blazers, we're talking about a 16th round pick in this year's 2020 draft, a guy who turned into Isaiah Stewart from the University of Washington, a pick that Houston did not even keep. They ended up sending it to Detroit, who acquired, it felt like 40 of the 60 picks that were made in the NBA draft. But beyond that, the pick next year will very likely be a pick in the late teens or 20s. It could be late 20s if the Blazers team does as well as many people are projecting them to do. Bobby Marks, an NBA insider, just said he thinks they're the second best team in the West shortly before I went live. So that's kind of where this team is at right now. If that's the case, giving up this year's 16th overall pick and like the 27th pick next year and Trevor Ariza on an expiring deal for Robert Covington, yep, I'd give me that trade every day. I think that's a great deal for the Blazers. And I know some people are like, ooh, 2 first-round picks, but their window's now. You can't use a first-round pick on a guy like Nasir Little and let him wait 3 years. Dame and CJ aren't getting any younger. So you got to strike now, and this is the kind of move that shows that they did that. Next up, Enes Kanter. That's a name that everybody should be familiar with. Certainly all the Blazers fans out there will remember. Kanter was with the Blazers for a brief time during the 2018-2019 season. He came over at midseason. The Blazers needed him. He looked great. He looked really good in Portland. He played in 23 regular season games for the Blazers, averaged 13 points and 9 rebounds, and then started pretty much throughout the playoffs. This was after Yusuf Nurkic suffered his injury and he was unable to play. So the Blazers struck and grabbed Kanter, and he was so huge for this team. He averaged 11.5 points, 9.7 rebounds in the playoffs. He was running up and down the court, dragging Nikola Jokic with him. Kanter had a hurt shoulder, like a very injured shoulder, had a huge brace on throughout the playoffs and was still out there going toe-to-toe with one of the best big men on the planet. It was a really inspiring, epic performance from Kanter, and it was pretty disappointing to not see the Blazers bring him back. You could understand the rationale, obviously, with Nurkic healthy, but it still kind of stung a little bit. It felt like he had found a home. You know, he had found a place that he was playing really well. He'd had some issues with some other teams, and he was home. And then he went to Boston, and he was good in Boston last year, 8 points, 7.5 rebounds, but his role was much reduced. Boston's got a lot of dudes. They had a lot of guys in their front court, and they just didn't have much of a need for Kanter. So when the season ended, apparently they made him available in trade. There was a trade agreed to between Memphis and Boston that included the 30th pick, which it turned into Desmond Bane from TCU, going over to Memphis, and the Blazers piped in and said, hey, we want to be a part of this trade, and managed to work it out so that they sent Mario Hezonja to the Grizzlies and acquired Enes Kanter with part of their trade exception that they got from the Kent Bazemore deal last year. So this is another fantastic trade. There's really no other way to look at it. Mario Hezonja was bad. I think you look at this trade, there's 3 great things that happened. 1, the Blazers acquired Enes Kanter. That's the first and foremost thing that happened. 2, the Blazers got rid of Mario Hezonja. 3, This solidifies that the Blazers are not re-signing Hassan Whiteside. Those are three good things that happened in this trade. Kanter is the NBA's ideal backup center. Statistically, he's one of the highest performing backup centers in the league. And that's exactly what the Blazers got him to do. This is what I love about this offseason so far for the Blazers. They're just picking up dudes to put them in the spots that they need to be. I know that sounds super simple. It doesn't sound like something that you should be like raucously celebrating. It's like, oh, the Blazers are signing guys who just fit with where they need to be. But that's, yeah, we're going to celebrate that because sometimes they don't do that. They tried to start Zach Collins at the 4. He's not a 4. They signed Anthony Tolliver to play big minutes. They signed Kent Bazemore to play him out of position. They've done this kind of stuff in the past. And this year it's like, okay, we need a really good backup center. We're not going to try to shove Hassan Whiteside into a backup center role. That's not where he fits. That's not what he's good at. He doesn't fit the needs of this team. Yes, he's a good shot blocker, but he's not a good rebounder. He's not a good defensive player at all. He's horrible on the pick and roll. He doesn't fit what the team needs. Now, Kanter's not a great defensive player, but he's a solid rebounder. He's a cerebral basketball player. And he has this experience being the backup center. So the Blazers said, this is the guy. This is one of the best backup centers in the league. He's familiar with this offense. He's familiar with many of the players on this team. He's familiar with the coaching staff. And he's familiar with this role. Bang, let's go get him. Meanwhile, Mario Hezonja just didn't fit. Frankly, I don't think that Mario Hezonja is an NBA player. I get the appeal. I get why he was a first-round pick. I get why the Blazers took a shot on him last year. He's this huge dude. He's like 6'8", 6'9", hyper athletic, moves extremely well, can get really hot from outside, can score in the paint, blocked LeBron James one time quite epically. So I understand that there's a lot of like intrigue in Mario Hezonja, but he has not been a good NBA player at all. And I wish him the best. I hope he finds a role in Memphis. I hope he can be a guy that that they can use, or that somebody in the NBA can use, but it was not going to happen in Portland. Obviously, Robert Covington kind of helped solidify that. Certainly Derrick Jones Jr., we'll talk about him in a second. He is going to kind of fill that role, a ninth type guy off the bench, and has a lot more potential than Hezonja. And I think is just a guy who hasn't really worn out his welcome. It's hard to get really talented players to be one of the last guys off your bench, but Hezonja just wasn't a guy that was worth really ever putting on the floor. And so I'm glad that they were able to move on from him and get Kanter in the trade, and then also get a guy like Derrick Jones Jr., who we can talk about now, who fills this role much, much better. You talk about the Blazers have young wings. Obviously, Derrick Jones Jr. is just 23 years old, 6'6" wing from UNLV. He's in his 5th NBA season. Very, very young, very, very raw player. It probably cuts significantly into the playing time of Nasir Little to the point where he's straight up out of the rotation. I'm potentially the 12th guy when I'm looking at this full roster on the rotation right now. So just not a guy who's going to play a lot of basketball this season. And that's okay. He's very raw. I don't think he's ready to be a significant contributor. We haven't really seen that from him. And the Blazers have this really good development machine where they kind of put guys into this incubator for 2 years, and then out pops a really solid rotation player. And they've done it really well with second-round picks, with Pat Connaughton, with Will Barton, with Jake Layman, Alan Crabb. They're going to probably do it with CJ Ellaby here. Gary Trent Jr. was a little bit ahead of schedule, but this is something they're really good at. And the first-round picks, it's been a bit more of a mixed bag. Anthony Simons, the jury's still out. Zach Collins, frankly, the jury's still out. They've had quite a few misses in the first round as well. But with Nasir Little, because he was so young, because he was kind of in a free fall in the first round, I think he kind of fits more that mold of the second round pick. And so I think that's kind of the plan the Blazers have is, hey, this guy wasn't really ready last year. We don't see a compelling reason to think he'll be ready this year, especially with just a month of an off season. So we're going to kind of put him in that incubator. We're going to bring some other guys in who can fill those actual roles, because again, we're not waiting till Dame's 33. We're doing it now. We want to win as many games as we can right now. And Nasir Little is not a guy to help us right now. For that matter, Anthony Simons doesn't appear to be a guy that's going to help them right now. So let's get guys who can fill those roles. And that's what they got in Derrick Jones Jr. Again, he's just 23, so it's not like he's dramatically older than the guys already on the roster, but he's in his 5th season. He's steadily improved his performance every year in the NBA. Last year, he played 23 minutes per game for a very good Miami Heat squad. You may remember them in the NBA Finals. He averaged 8.5 points, 4 rebounds, 1.1 assists, just about a steal and a block per game as well. He did see his role kind of diminish as the team got into the playoffs. Miami kind of shifted things around a lot when they got into the bubble. We saw former Zag Kelly Olynyk all of a sudden have a much bigger role. We saw Myers Leonard role reduced greatly. So they just kind of switched things up. It clearly worked for them. They went all the way to the NBA Finals. So, not knocking what they did, not necessarily something that I think is a huge indictment on Jones Jr. either. I think he just kind of fell out of favor briefly for a time. But if that's what caused him to look elsewhere for free agency and that's what caused the Blazers to go snag him, then even better. That's fantastic because I think this is another great pickup for the Blazers. So we talked about the 3-and-D status for Robert Covington, and Rodney Hood has always kind of gotten a little bit of that moniker of 3-and-D. Derek Jones Jr. is defense. The 3-point part is not there. He's a 28% 3-point shooter last year. He's not a shooter. I don't think that he magically becomes a shooter. I think that maybe he takes more threes in the Blazers offense, potentially, but he's not a shooter. It's not really his role. And I think that's okay. The Blazers have shooters. They have guys who can shoot from the outside. Rodney Hood, great outside shooter. Carmelo Anthony, good outside shooter. Robert Covington likes to shoot threes. He's pretty average, but he hacks them up like nobody's business. So Jones will be asked more to slash to the basket. He'll be asked more to kind of be not in the way on offense. I don't think, he can score by getting to the rim. He can score mid-range. He can get to the free throw line. He can do that stuff. But Derek Jones Jr.'s role on this team is going to be a defensive player and a really good one. Rodney Hood, not a great defensive player. Robert Covington, good defensive player. Carmelo Anthony does not play defense. Gary Trent Jr., good but unproven defensive player. I think he will be good, but they want somebody else who can come in and really lock dudes down. This is what Derek Jones Jr. is going to do on this team. I think when he's in the game, he's going to be asked to guard the other team's best player within reason. He's not going to go in and guard Nikola Jokic, certainly, but he's going to guard the Jamal Murrays of the world. He's going to guard LeBron in that game. He's going to be asked to guard the best players that they're facing, the best wings every single game. And he's good at it. 23-year-old dudes who already have good defensive instincts are hard to find. This is really great. And good defensive wings are so hard to find, and something Portland was sorely, sorely missing last year. You guys remember, we already talked about Al-Farouq Aminu and Mo Harkless. When the Blazers had those guys, those guys fit so perfectly with the team with Dame and CJ and Nurk on it. You have so much scoring already. You don't need like elite scoring forwards around you. You just need dudes who can maybe knock down an open shot and can play really good defense. Al-Farouq Aminu fits so perfectly on this Blazers team, and really so did Mo Harkless. They were hyper athletes. They were good defensive players who were interested in playing defense, and they weren't necessarily the biggest offensive contributors, and that's fine. That's what I think the Blazers have here in Jones. But beyond, when you compare him to Chief and Mo Harkless, those guys were finished products. They were in their late 20s, early 30s, I think, when they were here. I think that they were having some of their best seasons. Certainly Harkless could improve. Maybe Chief could too, but I think that they're probably, they probably peaked in Portland, if we're being perfectly honest. Jones Jr. probably hasn't peaked. I would be pretty surprised if we've seen the best from him, at 23 years old in a 23-minute per game role in Miami. That's probably not the best we're going to see out of Derek Jones. Now, I don't see 23 minutes per game for him this season on this Blazers roster, just because of Robert Covington and Rodney Hood and Carmelo Anthony and Gary Trent Jr. and everybody that they already have. I think he's going to have more of that similar role to what Hezonja was, where he's going to play. I think he's not going to get a lot of DNPs or anything like that, but he's not going to be asked to play huge minutes. He's not going to be asked to play 20 plus minutes per night, barring injuries or ineffectiveness or things like that, which obviously could happen. But I think you're going to see a guy who is starting to grow into his own. He's going to find himself as a role player. He's going to be a lockdown defensive player. He may not statistically change. He probably will statistically be a little bit worse than he was in Miami, but I think you're going to see a player growing and growing, and I think he's going to end up being a really, really good NBA player, hopefully in Portland. But if not, they got him for 2 more years at least to let him be that role that they really need coming off the bench. Last newcomer is Harry Giles. This is definitely just a dart throw for the Blazers, a big guy on a veteran minimum contract. We kind of knew that they would probably add somebody into that role, the Scalabissiere role that they had last season at least. And I really like this move. 22-year-old guy. He was actually involved in a draft day trade that brought Zach Collins to Portland. So him and Zach are kind of connected at the hip in that way. And now we're obviously connected again for both being similar age guys, similar performances up to this point in their NBA careers, and now have both unfortunately kind of gotten that injured big man moniker, which is maybe not necessarily deserved, although it has been the case for both of them, is that they have dealt with a lot of injuries. Giles is super athletic dude. He's averaged 7 points, 4 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game in his NBA career. It just hasn't been much of a career. He missed his entire rookie season. He played 58 games as a freshman, as a rookie in his second NBA season, and he played about the same last year. A guy that is a really good passer. He's bouncy. He's athletic. He's a good passing big man. I think the Blazers have things they could definitely do with him, but I don't think that they're counting on him much this year. I think the biggest thing that signing Harry Giles indicates is what we already kind of knew, which is Zach Collins is not going to be ready to start the season. He's not going to be ready on December 22nd. It's just not going to happen. I think you're looking at a guy who's probably not ready until late January, maybe even into February. And if that's the case, you have Nurkic, you have Cantor, you have Melo who can play the 4, and Covington who's going to play the 4. And then now you have Harry Giles. He's kind of in that role of like the third center, but also maybe the backup power forward if they need him to be, or they could play some 2 big lineups potentially. They have a lot of flexibility. That's something that I really like about this Blazers roster is they have flexibility. And Giles just adds to that a little bit. He's probably more of a center than a 4, but he can pass the ball. He can do some different things. And if they need to play him because of injuries or because of foul trouble or whatever reason, and he's healthy, he's going to give them some good stuff. And when you can sign a 22-year-old who can give you good stuff and might grow into something more for the veteran minimum, you do it every time. And this is a great move for the Blazers for that exact reason. So the other 2 moves we're bringing back, both Rodney Hood and Carmelo Anthony. I'm not going to go into too much detail about either of them because as Blazers fans, you know who they are. But Hood, he rejected his player option initially, and that was kind of surprising. It was like a day after the Robert Covington trade, so I think a lot of people thought, oh, the Blazers knew that Hood was going to leave, and they brought in Robert Covington to replace him. But I was listening to a podcast, the Locked On Blazers podcast with Mike Richman, and he was discussing how he thinks that Hood might be just rejecting the player option to come back on a multi-year deal. It makes sense for Hood to try to sign for multiple seasons so that he doesn't have to test free agency again next year. And the Blazers would be the one team that knows the most about his injury situation and kind of where he's at health-wise, so they might be more inclined to give him a multi-year deal. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly how it went down as the Blazers were able to re-sign him for a couple of seasons. He looked fantastic for the Blazers in the 21 games he played last year before he tore his Achilles. He played 11 points per game, was shooting 49% from 3. That certainly would not have held over a full season, but it was super fun to see him do that for the 21 games that he did play. He is a career 37% 3-point shooter, though, so it's not like he can't shoot something like 40% for a full year, especially with Dame and CJ taking so much perimeter defense attention, and also Yusuf Nurkic taking a lot of attention in the paint. Hood as the 4th scoring option on this team is excellent. Truly excellent. I think he's going to be one of the better 4th scoring options in the league. I really believe that. Again, he's more 3 than D. He's not going to give them a lot of defense, but when you get a guy like Derek Jones Jr., when you get a guy like Robert Covington, you can kind of mask Rodney Hood's defensive deficiencies. He's an effort defensive player. He's not lazy. He's not just doesn't care about playing defense. He does. He just isn't all that good at it. And that's okay, because I think most of the time he'll be playing with either Covington or maybe Derek Jones Jr. or certainly Gary Trent Jr. could be on the court with him at the same time. And that kind of helps mask some of those defensive deficiencies. They're able to put him on players who maybe aren't as much of offensive threats and kind of, again, hide that. So he's also 6'9", so he can play some 4. I think we'll see a fair amount of that this year, particularly as long as Zach Collins is hurt. Him and Covington will play at the same time, and they'll be somewhat interchangeable in those 2 roles, I think, and that'll be a really good thing. I think Hood, again, the flexibility is such an important part of this Blazers roster, and I'm kind of really excited to see what they do with that. So a couple more minutes before we get Brenna on. The main thing is just what's next for this Blazers team. And one thing that so many fans and analysts and everybody has been discussing that the Blazers need to do to this roster, it was discussed before the offseason started. It's still being discussed even after all the moves that they've made, is do they need to sign a veteran backup point guard? I'm in the camp that no, this is not something that the Blazers really need. And my reasoning is that CJ McCollum is the backup point guard. Technically, if you were to write out the roster, you would write the roster as showing Anthony Simons as the backup point guard. But CJ McCollum is the backup point guard. And they tried sometimes, I think in the last couple of years, they've kind of tried to have situations where both Dame and CJ are on the bench at the same time. And they had Evan Turner run the point, and they had Anthony Simons run the point, and they've had Mario Hezonja run the point at times last year. And it just doesn't work. And it's not just because they don't have that veteran point guard. It's just they don't have enough scoring with the rest of the players on their roster to not have Dame and CJ in the game at the same time. Obviously, injuries could crop up, and in that case, you probably would want a veteran backup point guard. And I think if people's logic is, well, we need injury insurance, then I kind of understand that. But ultimately, I think when Dame's not in the game, CJ McCollum's your point guard. Gary Trent Jr. can run the two. You have some combination of Hood, Jones Jr., or Robert Covington or Carmelo Anthony playing your other two spots. And of course, you have Yusuf Nurkic at the 5. And I think that that's a really good lineup. I don't see any problem with that. I think the Blazers will continue to do what they have done in the past, which is sub CJ out somewhat early and then bring him back in with the second unit as the starting point guard. And I think bringing in a veteran backup point guard who's not going to have a big role is just silly. Playing a veteran backup point guard at any point with Dame and CJ on the floor is not a good idea. Dame and CJ both thrive with the basketball in their hands. It's one of the things that has kind of hampered the Blazers, and is something that there's not a whole lot that they can really do about it. But when you have two really ball-centric guards, dudes who need the basketball in their hands to do something, it's pretty tricky. And Dame and CJ, to their credit, have figured out how to play together very well. And that's a testament to both of them as basketball players and just as people to kind of coordinate this and make it work. But you're not going to put another guy on the court who needs the basketball in their hands to thrive. It just doesn't make sense. And so I think they'd rather get another combo guard, which they did with CJ Ellaby, which they sort of did with Derek Jones Jr. And obviously the emergence of Gary Trent Jr. has made that sort of not necessary. And some people suggested maybe they use a second round pick on a point guard, or maybe they sign a young point guard. And that doesn't really make sense to me. I think if you're going to have a young point guard on your roster, just play Anthony Simons. The Blazers front office was so passionate about their feelings about Anthony Simons. Neil Olshey said he's the best player he's ever drafted, which is ridiculous and likely untrue. But, they're pumping him up. Evan Turner said he's going to be like an all-star caliber player. Those were quotes that some of these guys said. Probably too early to say that about Anthony Simons, and I think that it actually contributed to some of his struggles last year was maybe an unnecessary amount of pressure put on him by the front office and by some of his teammates. But they really care about him a lot. The staff really believes a lot in who he is. So why would they sign somebody else to take minutes away from him? I don't think Anthony Simons is ready for a big role. It's pretty clear to me, in fact, that Anthony Simons is not ready for a big role. But there's no reason to sign somebody ahead of him. The role that he's going to have on this team next year is already pretty small because Dame and CJ play so many minutes, because CJ can be that backup point guard. You don't need Simons to play a ton of minutes. And so I think you'd rather just keep the roster the way that it is and kind of just roll into the season with what they have. I don't think there's any more moves to be made. I think Hassan Whiteside is gone. I already mentioned that, but it's worth reiterating. There's no reason for the Blazers to re-sign him and no reason for Whiteside to want to come back. Caleb Swanigan and Wenyen Gabriel are gone. I think the only other move that could be made is the team could re-sign Jalen Hoard back on a two-way deal. But as it stands right now, they have 14 guys on their roster. Yusuf Nurkic and Enes Kanter are your centers. Robert Covington, Carmelo Anthony are your power forwards. Rodney Hood, Derek Jones Jr. at the 3. CJ McCollum, Gary Trent Jr. at the 2. And Lillard and Simons at the 1. That's 10. Your other 4 guys are Zach Collins, Harry Giles, Nasir Little, and CJ Ellaby. That's 14. Last year, the Blazers kept 14 for most of the season. They wanted to have an extra roster space. They said for flexibility reasons. It was probably for salary cap reasons. That's likely going to be the situation again this year. I do think Hoard could get that 15th spot on a two-way deal and potentially be brought up and down the roster that way. But I think that's kind of it. I think that's what year 2020, 2021 Blazers, yeah, that's right. What year is it? I don't even know what year it is. It's been a long one. 2020, 2021 Blazers, I think that's what they're going to look like with those 14 guys. Don't think we're going to see a lot of other additions, and I think that's okay. I think this has already been a fantastic offseason for Neil Olshey and the rest of the staff, and I'm really excited to see what this team is going to do. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break right now, but when I get back, I will be joined by Brenna Greene, the sports director at KREM 2 in Spokane, and her and I are going to discuss the upcoming college basketball season for the Zags, as well as some Pac-12 football and a little bit of more information about the Blazers' newest draft pick, CJ Ellaby. Right after this.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. I am so excited to have Brenna Greene from KREM 2 in Spokane with me today. Brenna, thank you so much for repeatedly always saying yes when I ask you to come on and do stuff with the podcast and with the radio show. I seriously appreciate it so much.
No problem at all. It's there isn't a lack of news right now to talk about, that's for sure.
I know. I was reading like right up until about 6:55, like, okay, am I going to miss anything? Are the Blazers going to sign somebody else? Is another basketball game or football game going to get canceled? Like what's going to go down? I know that that's pretty much been your life for the last month and really a little bit longer than that too.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of all of March, and then we kind of had a lull, and then all of August was like that, and then we picked right back up in November, baby. So there you go.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to ask first is just what it's been like. You know, I know we talked a couple of times about just the experience of obviously having, you know, you were at the Pac-12 tournament in March when things got shut down, and then having such like a long lull and having to find other things to cover, and then obviously have it all come roaring back in the last month or so. Just kind of what has that experience been like for you in the role that you have?
It's definitely different. It's forced us in some situations to kind of think outside of the box to fill and to have interesting stories to tell. But I kind of like thinking outside of the box and doing different things. So honestly, it was kind of was a welcome change in a way. You know, and then the thing that's difficult right now with all these games is that, you know, everything is 5 seconds away from getting canceled. So you really can't plan for much. You just have to hope it all works out. So, you know, there's definitely way more breaking news than what I am used to.
Yeah.
And, you know, like today, like I was supposed to work ahead on a piece today. I haven't touched that piece. Haven't touched it because of all of the college basketball news that happened today. So, you know, it's definitely something where you kind of have to keep your head on a swivel at all times. So, yeah.
I mean, last week we had breaking news during my radio show, so we'll see if we go 2 for 3 on that happening. But that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the breaking news that happened last week was the Robert Covington trade for the Portland Trailblazers, and obviously them losing that first round pick, but they did use their second round pick, and they acquired with the 46th pick CJ Ellaby, a combo kind of guard forward from Washington State. First player from Washington State to get drafted since Klay Thompson. So I think Blazers fans can safely assume that they have the next Klay Thompson. Is that
that's totally it. That's totally it.
Obviously, right?
He is the third fastest player in WSU history to get to 1,000 points. Okay. So he is able to score at will per se. I think he came close. He came close to beating some sort of Klay Thompson record. Maybe it was his sophomore year scoring record. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
I would safely assume definitely we're looking at the Blazers roster. I could see him ending up becoming a two-way player this year, especially since, you know, he wasn't somebody that everybody had on their draft boards.
Right.
It was kind of shocking that he got picked that high. I mean, it definitely shocked me. I wasn't ready for that. I was like, whoa, okay. Thankfully we prepped web stories before, so it was very easy to just insert X, Y, and Z. And so we got it up quick online. But yeah, I would imagine he'll probably spend a little bit of time in the G League this year, if there is a G League this year.
Yeah, it's funny. I was surprised to see CJ Ellaby get drafted too, obviously, and I was surprised to see Portland go after him. But I had been doing some prep on like second round pick for the Blazers, and when you look at their track record with general manager Neil O'Shea, they've so heavily prioritized like guards, like experienced college guards from high major programs who were like a huge integral part of the team. You know, you look at like Alan Crabb was like everything at Cal when he was there. Pat Connaughton was so huge at Notre Dame. He was kind of almost their whole team in that spot as well. And then Gary Trent Jr. kind of breaks that mold a little bit, but Will Barton was similar to that as well. Like they definitely have a type with what they go after in the second round. And I had been paying attention to CJ Ellaby. Like I knew who he was, and I saw the Blazers picked him. My first thought was kind of shock. And then I was like, this actually tracks a lot with what they've done in the past. So it kind of, and of course the Blazers like to go, they pick a lot of guys that kind of make you turn your head a little bit too. And that's kind of what we had here. So I know you had a chance to speak with Ellaby about his, getting drafted by the Blazers. And I know he said he's really excited to be coming to Portland. Can you just talk a little bit about what you heard from him and maybe what Blazers fans can be excited about with him?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely is thrilled to stay in the Pacific Northwest. I think that he's really excited about that. He reiterated it time and time again. He talks a lot about Brandon Roy and how he has always followed Brandon Roy and was really into watching him on the Blazers, which same. I think that this is something that, he said, the first thing he said in the press conference was that if he could pick a team to go to, it would have been the Blazers. Mm-hmm. So definitely something where he's definitely getting to live out a bit of a dream here, which is very, very cool for him. I think that he takes it very seriously that he's the first player since Clay to get drafted from WSU, and he knows that he has some pressure on that a little bit just because of the fact that WSU isn't known for cranking out NBA talent. Mm-hmm. And, if he can do it, if you can have him and Clay in the league doing it at the same time, you might be able to get a few more guys to, relocate to Pullman, which is not the easiest of tasks for a lot of recruits.
So how did the Washington State fans take it when he talked about how much he loved Brandon Roy and his University of Washington roots?
I'm sure it's okay. You know what? And I feel this as somebody who, grew up a huge Oregon fan and then went to Gonzaga. Like, if there's anybody who I'm like, I don't care that you went to UW, because to be fair, I was born and bred to not like the Huskies. Right. It's Brandon Roy. It's like, I don't even like think about the fact that he played for UW. He's like easily the person that I have the most grace for in terms of that. So I'm not saying that I totally hate the Huskies now or anything like that, but growing up, it was definitely something where it was like, you will not like the Huskies. Yeah. That was very much ingrained into me. So, but it never felt like that growing up with Brandon Roy. And I think he's kind of somebody that transcends that label a little bit.
Brandon Roy is bringing Oregon and Washington fans together. Look at that.
Yes.
Moving on from CJ Ellaby, I want to talk about another who we were hoping would be a second round pick alongside Ellaby. If you'd asked which of these two guys would get drafted, I think the vast majority of people would have gotten it wrong, because Killian Tilly did not end up getting selected. Gonzaga great big man from France who had an excellent 4-year career for the Zags, but unfortunately dealt with a lot of injuries during his career, which almost certainly played a part in him not getting selected, because I think if you ask me and anybody else who watched him, the skill set that he has translates really well into today's NBA. But he obviously got a chance to sign with the Memphis Grizzlies. He's going to be reunited with Brandon Clark, his teammate for a couple of years at Gonzaga. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to talk to him since then, or just have a sense of this fit for Tilly and kind of what he was going through before the draft, but just kind of what thoughts you have on him now that he's finally found his NBA home.
Yeah, I sent him multiple texts before the draft asking to see if he would do an interview with me, and he never got back to me. So that kind of made me a little bit like, okay, maybe he doesn't want to do this right now. You know what I mean? And who knows? He could have just forgotten to respond to me. So you never know in that sort of situation. But haven't heard a ton from him, even on social media after he got drafted. I mean, Ja obviously was excited about him coming, and he quote tweeted that and all that stuff. But I do know that the Grizzlies do have a lot of depth in terms of big men. So that is going to be something that he's going to have to try to break through. I pray and pray and pray that he's able to stay healthy.
Yeah.
His family, his mom and dad are the best. I love them. They're hilarious. So I'm just really like rooting for that family generally, where it's just like, like I really hope it all works out, because they're good people, and we'll just have to see what happens with it all. But boy, do I just hope that Killian is. I just hope so much that maybe the pandemic was a bit of a blessing to him, and he was able to just let his body rest.
Yeah.
Because he really didn't get to do that much at GU. It was just, okay, you're over this injury, come back. You're over this injury, come back. And then it was, and so he never really got like the time to really give to his body in the way that he should have. And so I just really hope that he can turn a corner there in terms of that.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that makes me so nervous is I think first round picks are going to get a ton of grace if they have injury problems. You're going to get 3 or 4 years, even if you're hurt constantly. The Blazers just signed Harry Giles, who's been hurt for so much of his career, but because he was a first round pick, and the second round picks probably get a little bit of grace. But if you're an undrafted guy and you're on a 2-way deal, like your first injury, that might be it. And that's what makes me so nervous. That's why I felt so like anxious when I didn't see his name come up. I was hoping like maybe one of the LA teams will take him here right at the end, or Golden State right at the end, or something like that, because I thought he would fit some of those teams. But I think that's the fear, is like, the injury history, and maybe teams didn't get enough of a look at him. I don't know, but hopefully if he can stay healthy and get into some games this year, I think his odds of actually sticking in the NBA go up a ton, because I think the skill set is absolutely there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he totally fits the NBA. There's no question about that.
6'10" dudes who shoot 40% from 3 in all 4 years in college. That's not something that you see every day. So excited for him. Hopefully he'll find a home and stick there. All right. So kind of transitioning back into the current college basketball team, sans Killian Tilly, sans almost all veteran players. They have Corey Kispert, their senior leader, and of course Joel Ayayi coming back. But this team is absolutely ridiculously loaded. I know you've gotten a chance, even in the midst of a pandemic, to see some of them and hopefully interact with coaches less, I imagine, than you've done in the past. But with the season a couple days away, hopefully, we have not heard any concerns about Gonzaga or Kansas at this point. Can you just talk about like players and what your overall level of interest and excitement, and how Gonzaga fans should feel about this team with the season about to start?
I mean, the hype is real.
Yeah.
Like I cannot tell you how bummed I'm going to be if they win an NCAA championship there this year and I'm not going to be able to be there. I'm going to be so bummed. It's just, and obviously that's selfish, and obviously like that's something where if it happens, that's still awesome if they're able to win one. Right. I mean, right now the Kansas game seems set. It seems good to go. Bill Self had media availability today, said it was good to go. So I guess in Bill Self we trust, and we just keep on pushing. I really hope that I feel like that Tennessee game is dead in the water right now. Yeah. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't know how it could in the span of 9 days. There's just, when you have multiple positive COVID cases on a team, it's problematic. And the spread has already happened. And, Baylor, I feel more confident in. I feel a lot more confident in that Baylor game still happening. So, I at least hope they can get one of those 2 games for their schedule. But generally this is a team that is deep, that, like you said, doesn't have a ton of veteran leadership, but I mean, I've watched Corey for 2 years now. He's a phenomenal leader. Even when he wasn't really the leader, he was still a good leader for GU. So I don't think they need a bunch of guys at the helm because Corey can handle this by himself. He's got it. He's a fun guy to watch lead. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just kind of like, it makes you happy when you watch him lead because you just know that he's doing it right.
Right.
So, I think that they're fine in terms of that leadership standpoint. Joel's a little bit quieter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that they're kind of good Robin and Batman in terms of that. Batman and Robin, sorry, switch that around. It's been a long day. But yeah, I mean, from all accounts I've heard, Dominic Harris has had a pretty good fall.
Yeah.
For that from multiple people within the program, that he's looked really solid. I think that people can expect for him to maybe contribute a little bit more than what maybe some people forget about him because he's been committed to GU for so long.
Right.
Stroth right now, we're not sure what his situation is. And then obviously there's Jalen, who everybody has very, very high expectations for.
Yep.
And then you've got a whole group of sophomores. I mean, I think a lot of times people are forgetting about Anton Watson and just how incredible he was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I watched him in high school. Like we had, I was looking through our high school open last year that we had, and we had two Anton Watson dunks in it. That's how impressive the kid is.
Yeah.
So, if that shoulder's healthy, I think he could really shock some people. And obviously Temmie is one of the most talked about guys in the country right now. And I that's another phenomenal family I've gotten to know over the years, and they are just wonderful. And, Drew's so funny to cover because he's such a character. He really is such a character. The other day when at Craziness in the Kennel, he did a dunk and he looked at everybody that was shooting and he goes, "Anybody get that? Because I want it. Because I never jump like that. I need you to get that for me." Okay, all right, Drew. And he has these elaborate handshakes with all of his teammates. It doesn't matter if it's a walk-on or Corey Kispert. He has this crazy elaborate handshake with each one of them. So just a lot of really fun guys to cover, and the sky's the limit. The sky's the limit, and I think now they're the undisputed number one preseason team coming into the country with Baylor losing the player that they did.
Yeah. So Gonzaga is ostensibly going to tip off against Kansas. We're keeping our fingers crossed that game's going to happen. So far, so good with what both coaches have said. Assuming that game happens 10:30 on Thursday, what do you expect to see? What do you think the starting lineup's going to look like? And kind of, is this team going to be? I think a lot of what has been discussed is that they're not going to be as post-heavy scoring-wise. Philip Petrusev just got the ball nearly every half-court possession last year because I think I read somewhere that it was the lowest scoring guard group in Gonzaga history, or not in their history, but in a while. And obviously Ryan Woolridge and Admon Gilder were very good, but the scoring went through the paint. And this year, when you added Jalen Suggs and when you have the expected improvements from Joel Ayayi, I'm really curious if you think the offense is going to look different, if Mark Few is going to keep doing the same thing he's been doing, and who you think is going to be in that starting five when they tip off, hopefully on Thursday.
I don't see Ballo starting.
Yeah.
Mark Few has said, Mark Few said that he has progressed a lot. But from the way he has said it, it makes it sound like to me he's coming off the bench right now.
Gotcha.
So I would expect that starting lineup to be Jalen. Long day. Jalen, Joel, Corey, Anton, Drew.
Yep.
I think Anton has proved himself, and I think that Anton has the trust of the staff right now. And I think that's really important with Few. If you have Few's trust, you're in. Case in point would be Joel Ayayi. He did not have Few's trust, and he had to play his way onto the court to get there. He had to show Few on the court that he could do it, because Few Few didn't think he was going to do anything at GU. I think Few was like, yeah, he's going to transfer. See ya.
Right.
So, you have to do that. So right now I'd say that's Anton's spot to lose. So that's what I imagine the 5 would be. Heard a lot of good things about Aaron Cook. From a few sources inside that, he's really challenged Jalen.
Good.
So I would imagine we might see Aaron being the first guy off the bench. So definitely solidly within the rotation. So yeah, that's kind of my read on everything there right now.
One thing that I don't want to say concerned, because I don't really have a lot of concerns about this roster. I think that they're extremely good, but I saw this in, I think, an article at The Slipper Still Fits, and I would challenge anybody to think about this for a second. If you had to guess who had the most 3-pointers made on this team last year, that wasn't Corey Kispert and Joel Ayayi. And the answer, do you know who it is?
It's Arlaskis, isn't it? No. Oh, no. It's Matt Lang. Sorry, my bad.
It's Matthew Lang. Walk-on Matthew Lang hit 4 or 5 last year.
Seder Pride.
Heck yes. We got to give a shout out to Matt Lang. But
yeah.
So there's
the same high school, in case people didn't put that together. There you go.
Sorry, yes. So you have a lack of 3-point shooting experience. Obviously, Kispert and Joel are good outside shooters. I think the expectation is that many of the Tricky Trio members will be good outside shooters. Dom certainly showed that he likes to shoot 3-pointers in the Craziness in the Kennel. He didn't knock any down. I'm not overly concerned about that. I think he's going to be a good outside shooter. But is that something, this has been such a huge part of Gonzaga's offense for so long. Is it something that people should be worried about, or do you think their guys will step up?
I think that I'm personally not worried about it right now, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to get worried about it.
Right. That's fair.
I remember last year, right around this time was when Kispert was in his shooting slump. He couldn't hit a 3 in the ocean.
Yeah.
So, it's going to happen. And what happens, if both Corey and Joel have off nights? Joel, coming into the WCC championship last year, he had some issues with hitting 3s. And then all of a sudden, once he got to the tournament, he turned it on again and he was okay. But he had a slump there during conference play as well. So these guys can definitely both, I don't know if streaky is the right word, but they can just kind of lose their touch at times. And it takes a few games to get it back. Yeah. So you have to hope that doesn't happen at the same time.
Right.
Jalen can obviously shoot from 3. There's obviously other guys on that team that can shoot from 3.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's just new faces, and you have to test out and see, how those new faces fare before I feel like I can really make any sort of judgment on that. Because you look at, the team coming into last year's team coming in. Well, you had Admon and you had Ryan. And nobody knew. People kind of knew how Admon was going to do, but Admon also hadn't played in a while.
Right.
And, Ryan had played at North Texas. So nobody really knew how that was going to go either. And they seemed to do just fine from 3. So, I understand the concern, but I think that we kind of have to wait it out to see if that's founded or not.
So I'm not going to make you make predictions, because that's just super silly in a season where we don't even know which games are going to be played or not played, or which teams are going to have cancellations and so on and so forth. So that seems silly. We know this Gonzaga team is really good. We know that they can win every single game that they play. We just don't know how many they'll play or how the other teams that they're going to play are going to do. The last thing, the couple players that I wanted to talk to you about real quick, because they're 2 of my favorites and guys who don't get talked about nearly enough, is the Martynas Arlauskas and Pavel Zakharov, 2 2019 guys who I think are probably a little bit outside the rotation right now. But one thing that you brought to the attention a lot last year was how Martynas Arlauskas stayed after, I think, pretty much every single game.
He's the dude.
Was working on his shot. It's just awesome.
Lots of respect for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've never spoken to him before, because I haven't had any reason to be completely frank with you.
Sure.
But his work ethic is special. from what I've seen at least. It was always him and Will Graves that were out there after games, and Will would be rebounding for him, and Martinez would be out there shooting. I'm rooting for him to make an impact. I wonder if maybe Gonzaga looks at those guys and says, maybe it's time for us to redshirt you now.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen with that. They haven't made any sort of announcements on red shirts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure, but if I were them, I would be strongly looking at that.
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, you kind of assume maybe not. There's a possibility that Drew Timmy's done after this year if he has a good enough season and wants to go professional. And that Corey Kispert is done after this year. That's an obvious guaranteed. Mm-hmm. Even if he does get an extra year of eligibility, he's not coming back. Joel Ayayi, probably not coming back. Jalen Suggs, 100% not coming back. Those are all things that you kind of know. So if you look at like Arlauskas, a role opens up next year pretty clearly. For Zakharov, a role potentially opens up if Drew Timme leaves. So yeah, I could see a red shirt for those guys. I think that would make some sense. It's kind of nice for Gonzaga to stick to their roots in a way of like the European recruits who are not high on the radar, who sit out a year or kind of role players for the first couple of years. Like, I think a lot of programs that would go away when they can just recruit a whole bunch of top 30 dudes like the Zags are doing, but they're still kind of keeping that like part of their core with them. And I think that that's really cool. And I hope that these guys, they may never be that, they're probably not gonna be the next Rui or the next Domantas Sabonis. I don't think that those guys are at that level necessarily, but it's still kind of cool to see them keeping that routine that they've done so well for the last 2 decades alive.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's starting to go away at GU. I wonder if Joel Ayayi is the last of a dying breed with that program. I really do.
Yeah.
So, we'll see what happens, but obviously their recruiting has just taken off the past few years. If you get Chet Holmgren in there, it's all bets are off. Like, that's just another huge get for them. So, and I would imagine that, Fanbo, the Chinese player they just got to commit, I would imagine that he would be a pretty obvious candidate for a red shirt. Yeah. But we'll just have to see. I really hope that it'll work out for them. But like I said, Gonzaga is just upping their recruitment game so massively right now.
Yeah.
That they're gonna probably have to make an impact soon. And if they don't, they may need to go elsewhere. Right. So I really hope that it works out for them. I really, really do. I'm just saying that these recruits are just getting better and better and more stars and more stars.
I mean, you look at, and I don't know all of the ins and outs of this story specifically, but the way that it was kind of portrayed or that it appeared that it happened was that Ben Gregg was super interested in going to Gonzaga, and the Zags kind of came on him after they found out that Paolo Banchero was going to go to Duke. Again, there's probably a little bit more to that story, but we're talking about a dude who's like top 30 in his class who wanted to come to Gonzaga, and the Zags were like, well, hold on, let us look at other guys. And like that's a crazy story 3 years ago for this program, and it's already happening now. Like, that's insane.
I mean, from what I've heard, that pretty much is the story. Yeah. I've talked to Ben about it I've done 2 different interviews with Ben now, and that sounds exactly like it. I mean, when I did my sit down with him and Caden Perry, another Gonzaga commit, Caden said that Ben had told him throughout them playing AAU basketball together that he wanted to play with him, that he wanted to go to Gonzaga and play with him. So this was a dream for Ben, and it just wasn't reciprocated from Gonzaga's standpoint, at least not as emphatically. Right. If they would have offered Ben, he would have committed a year ago.
Wow.
So, I really think so. When I aired the story that I did with him and Caden, he's like, hey, can you let me know when that airs? My grandma is going to want to watch it in Spokane because that's, his grandma lives here. So, this is a big place for him. So, I really think that, a few years ago, they would have offered Ben years before.
Yes. Yep.
Years before.
Yeah.
So it's definitely been really interesting to watch and kind of watch from the inside the leveling up in terms of recruiting.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's probably something to be said for all of those guys that we've talked about being local, in the sense that Caden Perry and Ben Gregor from Oregon and Bancheros from Washington. And maybe it's a bit of a blip in the sense that there's just a lot of elite big man talent in those states right now. But I think that this story is going to become a bit more common going forward. I'd be surprised if it suddenly drops off after they get, Suggs, who's a top 10 guy, potentially Holmgren, definitely Greg, who's a top 30 guy. Like, I think this is kind of just the story going forward.
Yeah. And, the big thing is that they have to make sure that they're maintaining their standards for character as they go through recruiting these guys, because that's where it gets really tricky. Mm-hmm. Because, obviously a lot of high level recruits also have high level heads.
Yes.
So you have to make sure that you're bringing in guys who fit the culture. And that's one of the difficult things, I think, when you kind of break into this world that Gonzaga has finally broken into.
And you look at the high level programs, and a lot of them have been able to do that. The ones that have stayed high level for a long time. Some of them have kind of ebbed and flowed. You look at like Memphis, another program, or Arizona, programs that have had highs and lows because they haven't necessarily cared as much about that standard. And so Gonzaga hopefully can maintain that for a really long time, at least as long as Mark Few is there, I would hope.
There's a few guys who have gone to Arizona who were looking at Gonzaga that now I think may regret their decision. That's all I have to say.
Yes, I would imagine so. All right, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to transition to talking about the other program in the Inland Northwest, Washington State. We kind of touched on some of the struggles that college basketball is having with scheduling games, and certainly Pac-12 football has had a lot of issues with that as well. So we're going to talk to Brenna about that when we get back.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back again to Brenna Greene. We're going to switch to talking about Pac-12 football and specifically Washington State in a second. But I know you know this, obviously, Brenna, but it sounds like now Washington State, not only is their next couple of football games in question, but it sounds like their first basketball game might be in question too. I saw the report from you that Eastern Washington has COVID positive tests. They're not going to be able to play Oregon. Now they might not be able to play Washington State. So my question is, Washington State baseball the next sport that they're going to get a chance to play, or what is the deal? This poor program is having no luck right now.
Technically, Washington State is going to get to play not technically. They're going to get to play their season opener. Mm-hmm. Yeah, from what I have heard, their season opener against Texas Southern on Wednesday is on. We are good to go. So they'll at least get one basketball game in. They're very, very lucky that they haven't had any other positive cases, considering that their head basketball coach tested positive last week.
Yikes.
I was on the phone with my weekend sports anchor when I got an email that said an update from WSU basketball, and I went, that ain't good in 2020.
Nope.
Oh, no.
Not what you want to hear.
Nope, not what you want to hear. But Kyle apparently has been Kyle Smith, their head basketball coach, has maybe been even more active than what he was when he was in the office. So I guess he's blowing people's phones up over there with thoughts about the team. So it's good to hear that he's doing okay, and that program has been able to stay in the clear.
That's good. So sticking with football, I guess. Mm-hmm. So obviously not going to play Stanford. They had a positive test. Washington State had positive test to their quarterback and a handful of other guys, as I understand it. Now the Apple Cup is not happening. Nope. Do you know any updates on if they're going to try to reschedule it, if they're just scrapping it completely?
They're going to try. Mm-hmm. They're going to try. The question is if it works. Yeah. I mean, obviously this is a situation where, first of all, the obvious date to try to redo it is on December 19th when they have all those free games.
Right.
It just depends on if UW is able to challenge Oregon for that Pac-12 North crown. Right. And, if they went out, then they got to go to the championship game. And it's tough cookies for Wazoo. um, so yeah, it seems as though both schools really want to make it happen. And it could be a situation where, in a few weeks, it's Wazoo who's getting games canceled on them, and UW gets their game canceled, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, well, let's play the Apple Cup this week.
Right.
So there's just a lot. Never make a plan. I made a plan for the next 2 weeks last week, starting today, and it's changed a lot. And I finally decided yesterday, we're just not going to send out the plan.
It's just not worth it.
It's not worth it. It's not worth it. I'm just going to have to keep sending out emails correcting the plan, which I would have had to do, because if I would have sent it out last night, guess what? Boom. Eastern. We don't know what's going to happen with that game against Wazoo, but I know if I were a betting woman, I'd say that it's probably not going to happen.
Right.
So, that would have been, this is weird. I'm going to be taking Thursday through Sunday off during Thanksgiving for the first time since I was 22. 28 now. Yep. It hasn't happened. So it's just, this is uncharted territory for all of us. I'm like, oh my God, I get the 4 days of Thanksgiving week off. If that Saturday game gets canceled, I'm like, what is this? So yeah, they have 9. The last update we got from WSU is that they have 9 guys in the protocol. I would imagine, who knows? It might not have gone up. And I would imagine also that not all of those 9 are positives. They're also people who've been quarantined. You could very easily have a situation where only one guy tested positive on Friday before they traveled, but there's 4 guys who live together.
Right.
Boom. You got 4 guys out. It's over. So, there's a lot of possibilities in that situation right now. So yeah, it's unfortunate. It's too bad.
Yeah.
I hope that things will get better down there, especially since students they are very much encouraging students to not be on campus or to not be living off campus. The problem is that this is where the problem lies, is that a lot of kids decided, well, I still have to pay for my apartment, so I'm coming back. And that's where things got real sketch in Pullman.
Yeah.
And I know that there's some frats that are still open. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah. So, that's how this stuff goes around. And all of a sudden you got it on the football team.
So with Washington State, I remember after their first game, they had like a ton of guys who weren't able to play. And if I'm remembering correctly, Coach Rolovich wasn't super forthright about why there weren't so many guys who were able to. Do we know if that's related at all? If it was just something he wasn't saying?
So no, it wasn't actually. So they had one active case. Mm-hmm. So no, he didn't do himself any favors with that answer. Right. I don't really. He was the one who, because I was the one that asked the question that got the response of him telling us that they were down all these players.
Right.
And so of course, naturally, you have to follow up. I didn't ask the question, but you have to follow up and ask if it's COVID related.
Right.
That's a very understandable question.
We're in a pandemic.
And the way that he answered that question was very defensive. Mm-hmm. And it just he didn't do himself any favors. Yeah. He didn't do himself any favors. He could have just said, no, it actually doesn't have anything to do with coronavirus.
Right.
But instead he went on this whole rant about no corona, we just got to win. I don't want to talk about coronavirus. Well, that makes you look guilty. And he wasn't guilty. He wasn't.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah. Oh. So anyways, they had actually, coming out of the Oregon game, they had 0 guys in COVID protocols. 0. And by the end of the week, they had 9.
Wow.
So there's a lot of injury stuff going on. There's a lot of opt-outs. Mm-hmm. I guess, honestly, for a normal year, there's probably a normal amount of injury stuff going on. There's not a normal amount of opt-outs, but a normal amount of injury stuff going on. It just, and obviously they were expecting to travel on Friday. And that those 4 players who went out is what knocked them underneath the 53-man threshold. So they are at a point where they can, but I would be led to believe that they're, who knows? If they don't think they're going to be able to get back by next Friday, then that tells me there's probably some issues going on there, and hopefully they're back by the next week because they play on Friday again against USC. By the way, as we were in the break, I guess California schools are now having to prepare for, or are now having to move all their games because of the curfew. And WSU's game down there is supposed to start at 6:30, which would, I think, technically, I think they could get it done.
Right.
They could get that game done by 10. But the problem is you've got journalists in the stands.
Yeah.
You are in the, you've got people who have to clean up the facility. So can you do that after 10 o'clock?
Just tell the both teams to run hurry up offenses, I guess.
Yeah. So, there's a possibility that game could get moved up too. So yeah, just a lot of big question marks right now.
No planning.
Fun to cover.
No planning whatsoever.
Nope.
Yeah, I think the Cal game that got canceled against UW, I think it was one positive test that got that game canceled, or if that's what I read correctly. So it doesn't take much. It's what we're gathering.
Yeah, it was one positive test, and Berkeley's health department ruled the entire defensive line out.
Yeah,
because of that one positive test. So, that you can't play without a defensive line. That doesn't really work very well.
It would be pretty tough. Yeah. So the Pac-12 recently said that you can start scheduling non-conference games, which it seems strange to make that announcement at this point. I don't know if they were not expecting this amount of cancellations. I mean, certainly it's been a lot, but I can't imagine that if it shocked them, they weren't doing their jobs. I guess we'll put it that frankly. But is this I mean, obviously they're the team that is having the cancellations right now. So I don't imagine they've looked into much, but we've heard this whole UW BYU kind of fiasco where UW wants to host them and BYU doesn't want to go up there because they don't know if the game will actually happen because the Pac-12 rules, I think state that, correct me if I'm wrong, but state that if the game can be played by Thursday, if they know by Thursday, then they have to play the game. Is that right? So if
you know what? Honestly, I don't know. I haven't gone far enough down that rabbit hole because there's been a few other things going on.
Right, other stuff. But basically, I think BYU is hesitant to add the game because they think there's a chance that it wouldn't happen and that they just be kind of left high and dry, which is possible, but also wouldn't that be the case with any team that they would add? There's just no guarantee at all.
From what I've heard, they don't want to schedule that game because they want to see where they're at in the playoff standings or the playoff rankings.
Yeah. They don't want to lose and screw themselves out of getting a playoff spot.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of get, but also don't market yourself as anybody, anytime, anywhere.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's a different conversation. If you and I wanted to bag on BYU, we could probably round out the show doing that. I would imagine we have plenty of ammunition there.
Although I will say their sports information director had to work with him for a story about a local Spokane kid earlier, like a month ago or so.
Yeah.
Amazing to work with. So I will give them that. It was the best experience I've had working with an SID in a really long time. I'm not saying that I have bad experiences. I don't, but they were super helpful. So I'll give them that. I will give BYU that. So there you go.
Shout out to BYU and their SID. Perfect.
Yes.
So I know that we don't have as many games to go on as we would have hoped with Washington State, or at least we won't by the end of the season. But it's the first year post Mike Leach era, new coach, obviously new quarterback, lots of new stuff going on. They have played a little bit. You've obviously interviewed Coach Rolovich a lot, for better or worse. It sounds like it's been an interesting experiment with him. Likely not as interesting as Mike Leach, but interesting nonetheless. What have been your impressions of the new regime and kind of the new squad and what they've been able to do with the time that they have played?
I think generally it's hard to make impressions on the staff.
Sure.
Hard to make a judgment on the staff right now.
Yeah.
We haven't been let in. We just don't really see how they interact with guys.
Mm-hmm.
You lose something when you don't get that in-person interaction as a journalist, for sure.
Absolutely.
So it's hard for me to make any sort of judgment calls in terms of, what the staff is like, yada, yada, yada.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of hard for me to make a judgment call in terms of what this team is like because of the fact that Max Borghi's out.
Yeah.
That's their top returning player right there. And Dion McIntosh has done a phenomenal job. I'm not going to lie. He has way outperformed my expectations. Shout out to Dion.
Yep.
But it's hard without Max out there. Who knows how long Jaden's going to be sidelined for.
Mm-hmm.
So, you might see a new quarterback out there. From what I've heard, their backup quarterback, Gunnar Cruz, is really well respected amongst the team. He's known as a leader in the locker room, and I think that the guys would be pretty excited to play for him as well. But you just don't know. So yeah, it's a hard team right now to really know what's going on. I will say defensively, they've had some moments of real brilliance, and then they've had some moments of just absolute what is happening? They're sometimes, it's kind of a tale of two halves right now with this team. In the first two games they played, it was kind of similar. They played great against Oregon State in the first half. They had 3 turnovers against Oregon in the first half. In the second half, it's like I could score a touchdown on them. So, I just, that's something that's really key for me to look for is improvement in the second half of play in terms of their defense, because it has been abysmal in the second half. It's, they can't win games. The story of that Oregon State game makes it look like they had it in hand. They didn't.
Mm-mm.
If you don't get a Travell Harris just straight up the gut touchdown,
who knows?
They could have easily turned it back over and given it to Oregon State, and they could have had a game-winning drive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I'm confused about, the Jekyll and Hyde tendencies of this defense right now.
Yeah, it's been an interesting. I mean, obviously, without Borghi, I think it's a lot harder to judge this team. Clearly, they're not the same offensive scheme as they were under Mike Leach. Very few teams are even close to that level of pass heavy. And I think it's one of those things where to have a guy like Dion McIntosh step up and do what he did is I think pretty indicative of some promise. Like I would think that there's some optimism there. Max Borghi was quite public on Twitter about the fact that he is not out for the rest of the season. He wanted everybody to know that. So there's some optimism that he's coming back. Of course, trying to predict something a couple weeks down the line is absolute chaos. So who knows? I
take those things with a grain of salt sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
So, he could be saying that. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Is it actually true?
Right.
We don't know.
Yeah.
So who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, players tend to be a lot more optimistic about that than maybe they should be. I have friends who are athletic trainers, and this is about their worst nightmare is players saying things like that, which I can imagine why that would be the case.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw one thing at you that is not in our note sheet, but I think something that we're quite comfortable talking about and something that I meant to put in the notes but kind of forgot. But you recently posted a follow-up to a story you did about Gonzaga tennis player Katie Day. I just thought it was a really awesome story. I mean, a triumphant story. Certainly not all of it is positive, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about her story and where you're at now with that.
So, what's really interesting about the Katie Day story is that it kind of felt like it was a little bit meant to be for it to all happen the way it did in terms of me getting involved in it and things like that. I happened to be down in Portland in January doing a bunch of other stories when Karthik, my weekend anchor, texted me about this girl on the Gonzaga tennis team. And he was like, hey, you heard about this? We should try to do something with her. Like, I'm going to try to get something set up. And then I was like, oh, wait. And I like looked her up and I was like, wait. And it's like hometown, Lake Oswego, Oregon. And I was like, oh, that's my hometown.
I know that place.
And then I scrolled down her bio more, and it says cousin Megan played tennis at Pepperdine. Well, I've known her cousin Megan since 5th grade.
Oh.
So, and we went to high school together, and I was pretty close with her in high school. She's awesome. Like, you know, and I played club basketball with her when I was in 5th grade. So, you know, it's kind of one of those things where I was like, oh, this is kind of weird how this all happened, because I never would have met Katie Day.
Sure.
If it wasn't for that. And, you know, she goes to Gonzaga, and we had all these connections that I didn't even realize. But, you know, obviously nobody says cancer's meant to be. But, yeah, just a cool story about the fact that, you know, she started feeling really lethargic, and she thought it was anxiety, and she couldn't figure it out. And she was like, why am I feeling this way? This is weird. And just a bunch of tests later, and she had cancer. And I know that she was hoping to be clear of this a few months ago, probably like 4 months ago or so. But she didn't quite get there, and thankfully she got there a few weeks ago. So very excited for her, you know, to be able to move on from her life, from this chapter in her life. You know, it's a great story about the fact that, you know, this stuff can happen to anybody. It can really happen to anybody. And just really proud of her for the perseverance she showed. And it was very cool to see, you know, the Gonzaga community rally around her, especially Gonzaga athletes. And it was inspiring to see. And I was disappointed. Because of COVID, because she was planning on coming back up here for her senior day so that she could have her senior day with the tennis team. And obviously that did not happen.
Yeah, it's a bummer. Yeah, it's having worked in college athletics for a handful of years with student athletes, like there are so many cool stories sometimes if people dig in, and I think it's cool. Obviously, the benefit of being in a media landscape that is dominated by college athletics kind of maybe affords you more opportunities to do that, but it's I know it's fun for the athletes and the families and the community. Like, you know, I think a lot of people probably didn't expect to see a story about a tennis player at Gonzaga on their TV, and to get a chance to be able to hear about that is really cool. So, you know, good work on those kind of stories.
Thank you. I like being able to, you know, tell the off the beaten path story. It's a fun one for me. Yeah. So.
Well, Brenna, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk some Zags, talk some Washington State, bag a little bit on BYU, all the fun stuff that we get to do. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the next time that we get to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're going to take another break, and then when we get back, I'm finally going to give you all the talk about the Seattle Seahawks. They're 7-3. Things are looking bright after a couple of very dreary weeks to start the show. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will be back momentarily.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network. You're listening to the Pacific Northwest Sports Radio Show on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. Final segment. I've been teasing it all along. We're finally going to talk some Seattle Seahawks. I don't know. I don't think that I'm a jinx, but whenever I lead with the Seahawks, I plan to lead with them. They lose. They lost to the Bills. They lost to the Rams. You and everybody else in Seahawks Twitter world and Seahawks fandom in general was starting to hit the panic button, or smashing the panic button for many of you. There was some pretty fiery takes after their loss to the Rams last week. And understandably, it was a pretty disastrous game. Russ had one of the worst games probably of his entire career, certainly of this season, without a doubt. Pete Carroll had some highly questionable decisions, which is something that happens in wins too, but it's certainly more magnified in games that the team loses. And, you know, they were down to 6-3. They were technically in third place in the NFC West because of how hyper competitive it is. And they had a Thursday game coming up against the Arizona Cardinals. They still had a lot of injuries. People were in panic mode, and I get it. But here's the deal. The Seahawks rebounded. They found a way to win. They've now swept the Arizona Cardinals after winning 28-21 on Thursday Night Football. They are 7-3. And as of right now, They went from third, briefly jumped into first place in the NFC West, but are now settling into second place as just recently the Rams defeated the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Both teams have 7-3 records, and the Rams obviously hold that tiebreaker right now. That could change as the teams will face each other later in the season. But we saw some vintage Seahawks. We saw what we'd been seeing earlier in the year. We saw some things that we've been seeing from Pete Carroll-led teams for a decade now. Some smash mouth football on the ground, some hyper efficiency through the air, good defense, things that, we've seen a lot of in parts this year, but especially not the last few weeks, things that we haven't seen all together at once. And that's kind of what we got on Thursday night. Russell Wilson rebounded just like I thought that he would, and that I hope many of you thought that he would too. I know there was some concern about him after such a disastrous game, but Russ rarely does really poorly 2 nights in a row. He rarely even does bad 2 games in a row. It's pretty rare to see. I argued that his Buffalo game was not nearly as bad as many people thought that it was. He did have a handful of turnovers, but some of them were not his fault. But in this game, we got vintage Russ. 28 passing attempts, 23 of them were completions, 197 yards, 2 touchdowns, passer rating of 119.8. This is where he's back. 5 incomplete passes out of 28 attempts. And I say he's back because he's back to, being one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but he's not quite back to that level we saw before, like in the early part of the season where he was throwing the ball 37 times and throwing for 350, 400 yards. Kind of that let Russ cook mentality that we saw from the Seahawks early in the year when they just kind of unleashed him right away. Coach Brian Schottenheimer and the rest of the staff just were ready to just let him go. And that's not what we saw here. And I think that there is potentially some takeaways from that. Obviously, one notable takeaway is that Carlos Hyde was healthy, not Chris Carson, who is still not healthy, but hopefully will be ready for Week 12 when they face the Philadelphia Eagles. Not Rashad Penny, who has not played all year, but also might be in line to come back in Week 12 against the Eagles. It's unclear yet. But they had Carlos Hyde instead of having Alex Collins be the primary back, or DJ Dallas, or Travis Homer, or Bo Scarborough, who we saw a bit of in the Arizona game. They had a bruising running back, the kind of running back that Pete Carroll wants in his offense. And they utilized him. They didn't go full Marshawn Lynch and give him 24 carries in the game. They gave him 14 carries. He had 79 yards on the ground. He rushed for a touchdown. But I think that we kind of got back to seeing some of that Seahawks football that we have seen, that we've kind of come to know in this Pete Carroll era, that is different than what we saw earlier in the year. And there's some good and bad with that. There's lots of evidence from an analytical standpoint that passing the ball more, particularly on early downs, is good, and that doing run, pass, or run, pass, or being consistent about running the ball on early downs is not necessarily a good thing. And the analytics bear that out in a lot of ways, and you see a lot more high octane pass heavy offenses succeeding in the NFL, and NFL defenses adapting to defending a more pass heavy approach. But Pete Carroll has kind of just stayed the course on what he's done, for better or worse. And you can win a Super Bowl with an offense like that when your running back is a Hall of Famer in Marshawn Lynch, when 3 of your 4 starters in the secondary are Hall of Famers in Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, and Earl Thomas, when your middle linebacker is a Hall of Famer in Bobby Wagner, when your pass rush is Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, and you have other talented players like KJ Wright, Doug Baldwin, Jermaine Kearse, et cetera, extraordinarily talented roster back then. That setup doesn't work quite as well. We've seen them try to do super run heavy offensive attacks the last few years with not success, I guess. Obviously they've made the playoffs every year, but 2017, they've won a handful of playoff games in that time as well. But I think there was this huge kind of sigh of relief that this team was starting to really let Russ cook, for, to use the term that has been going around for so long. And it worked. I mean, it worked so well to start the season. And then until we had a game where the offensive line really struggled to pass rush against a good Bills front 7, and it left Russ unable to find open receivers. It led him to throw a couple of bad picks. It led him to fumble the ball a few times. And a big part of that game was the lack of a run game. As much as analytics kind of indicates that it doesn't say that running the ball doesn't matter, it more says that running backs themselves don't matter, which is a debatable point, but the argument that offensive line is what causes running backs to succeed more than the actual running backs themselves But you need a run game, a semblance of a run game. And when the Seahawks didn't have it in that game against Buffalo, you could see why it was such a challenge. The offensive line was struggling because they were constantly in pass protection. They weren't able to get out and maul guys out in front, which is what they're kind of more better suited for. And it was a challenge. And then the Rams game, everything just fell apart. Russ couldn't, even when he had time, he couldn't find his receivers. Jalen Ramsey locked down DK Metcalf. The defense wasn't there, and they just shut down. But then you get into this Arizona game, and it seemed like there was a bit of a reset. And this is a kudos to the coaching staff and the players to accomplish this reset in such a short amount of time, because this was the quickest break between games. They went from Sunday, obviously, to playing on Thursday night, which is extremely difficult. And I could do an entire segment about how Thursday night football probably should not exist if the NFL even pretends to care about player safety, which they pretend to care about player safety, but do very little to actually indicate that they do. And this is one of the most primary examples of that. But anyway, the Seahawks turned things around. Russ was hyper efficient. They did good work on the ground. Obviously, not only did Hyde have this 79 yards on the ground, which isn't a huge amount, but it's decent for 14 attempts. Russ had 42 yards on the ground and 10 carries. Scarborough had 31 yards and 6 carries, which is super efficient. And then in the passing game, obviously Russ, was hyper efficient, but also he hit 8 different guys. 8 different guys caught passes. And that's something we've seen a lot from the Seahawks this year. Russ is not afraid to throw the ball to anybody. They have a good group of receivers. Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, David Moore. Very, very good group of receivers. They also have multiple talented tight ends. Will Dissly caught a pass. Jacob Hollister caught a couple of passes. Greg Olsen caught a couple of passes. Now, we'll get to him a little bit later. And then they also had 2 running backs, DJ Dallas and Carlos Hyde, who each caught passes as well. So just the ability to kind of to spread the ball, to look at different targets, it stretches the defense really thin. Arizona struggled to guard DK Metcalf the last time out. Metcalf had 12 catches for over 100 yards and a pair of touchdowns the last time these two teams played each other. He didn't just chase down Budda Baker and tackle him, although that was the play that everybody remembered. He also had an incredible game on the field as a receiver, not just as a defensive player. So this game, you could kind of tell that Arizona was really trying to not let that happen again. DK still had a solid night. He only had 3 catches, but he only targeted 5 times. He had 46 yards and a touchdown. His 2 drops, one of them got quite a bit more attention than the other one got. If you did not see this, I do suggest you go check out the video. It's quite hilarious. It was towards the end of the game. It should have been a touchdown. Russell Wilson threw like a 96-mile-an-hour fastball. And the initial broadcast, for those of you who are watching it live, it was very unclear what happened. You saw Russ throw the ball. You saw DK appear to be open. You saw the ball hit the ground. You thought, okay, did it hit? It must have got tipped, right? It must have got tipped by a defensive player. My first thought was like, did it hit the goalpost? Because DK was running right in front of the goalpost. And then you saw the replay, and it turns out what happened is it hit DK Metcalf right in the helmet. Just pasted him right on the plastic face mask and bounced to the ground. You know what? It happens. DK, I know there's criticisms about his hands, and there's criticisms about, obviously, his route running was a big thing, and all this stuff. And then he had the non-existent game, and I think there are probably people out there who wanted to spin some kind of narrative here because he only had the 3 catches because he was under 50 yards. I'm not worried about it. Arizona did everything they could to try to prevent DK Metcalf from making an impact in this game. And he was literally just a ball that went through his fingers away from scoring 2 touchdowns again. He almost scored 4 touchdowns against the Cardinals this year. Clearly, there's not an issue. Clearly, the Seahawks and DK Metcalf and Russell Wilson are ready to play the Arizona Cardinals. They have their number. And one thing I mentioned last week when previewing this game was that if Arizona does a lot to try to prevent DK Metcalf from scoring, if they shade him, if they play him extra tight, if they do things to not let him get 12 catches like they did last week or last time they played, then I bet Tyler Lockett's going to have a really good game. And guess what he did? He was targeted 9 times. He hauled in 9 catches. Perfect. Tyler Lockett and Russell Wilson have been perfect before. They had a perfect passer rating for an entire year back in 2018. This is nothing unique to them. But to see them go 9 for 9 in this game, only 67 yards, but that's okay because they also led them into the end zone. And Russ didn't throw the ball down the field a lot. It was a lot more dink and dunks, but he found Lockett 9 times. He was hyper efficient in this one. And that's kind of what we wanted to see. One of the reasons the Seahawks are going to be so dangerous this year is that they have an elite quarterback and 2 elite receivers. And the Rams figured out a way to stop that, and kudos to them for getting it done. But the Cardinals did what they thought they needed to do, and it didn't matter because Tyler Lockett was there. It's really hard to defend two really good receivers, especially when the guy getting them the ball is really talented too. And so that's what we saw here from this team. Russ utilizing his weapons correctly, the Seahawks utilizing the run game correctly to keep the defense on their toes. It was just a really solid performance overall from the offense. And the defense was good too. The defense had 7 quarterback hits. That's not a huge number. That's a pretty good number against Kyler Murray, one of the fastest, most elusive, most difficult quarterbacks in the NFL to touch. And they got him 7 times. They brought him down 3 times, 3 sacks. The player to note here was Carlos Dunlap. Once again, an incredible performance from him. He has been fantastic since the Seahawks acquired him in front of the Buffalo game. I know he's only got 1 win under his belt in a Seattle uniform, but he had 3 quarterback hits and 2 sacks in this game. Just the amount of times that a player had 2 sacks for the Seahawks in a game last year, I don't know off the top of my head. I think it might have been once that it happened all year. They just did not have a consistent pass rush at all, and it hasn't been consistent this year by any means, but it's getting better. To get to Kyler Murray 7 times, to bring him down 3 times is huge. That's a monumental thing, and Carlos Dunlap is a huge part of that. You know who else could be a huge part of that? Darrell Taylor. And he's coming back. He might make his NFL debut in Week 12 on Monday night against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, for those of you who maybe cocked your head a little bit or furrowed your brow when you heard the name Darrell Taylor, he was the Seahawks' 2nd-round pick in the 2020 NFL draft out of Tennessee. He has yet to play. One of the reasons he fell into the 2nd round was because he was dealing with injuries in college and missed part of his college season. And people's fear was, well, if we draft him, we're not even sure if he's going to play in year 1. And that has so far been the case, is that he's been dealing with this injury throughout the season. He got very little time to be able to practice during training camp, did not play in the preseason, has yet to play. So I kind of teased him as a potential guy to help for the rest of the year. That's pretty optimistic to assume that he'll be able to do much. I mean, Pete Carroll talked about him on the Pete Carroll show on Monday morning on 710 ESPN and basically said, we're really excited about what he's capable of doing, but we haven't seen it yet. Like, he hasn't practiced yet. Pete is the most eternally optimistic coach on planet Earth. You cannot convince me otherwise. He is. And for him to say how excited they are is totally, right up his alley. But to say, like, we haven't even seen this guy on a football field yet, and we're in Week 12, might be a 2021 situation here. But I think it's just a good reminder that the Seahawks did try to upgrade their pass rush. They maybe didn't try hard enough, and that's something I've talked about on previous episodes as well. Something they could have done more. They could have re-signed Jadeveon Clowney, but he's not done anything for Tennessee. So maybe they dodged a bullet there. They could have gone out and tried to get Clay Matthews was a free agent forever. Everson Griffin didn't sign till the very end. He hasn't had a great year either. So maybe they knew something we didn't. But obviously the Darrell Taylor pickup to be an immediate contributor in year 1 has not come to fruition. LJ Collier did have a sack in this game, so that's been nice, but his emergence hasn't quite gone according to plan for the former 1st-round pick. Rasheem Greene's been dealing with the injury, so he had been struggling to stay onto the field. He did play in this game and looked okay. Didn't get to the quarterback, but again, it helped put some pressure on him at least. So it's a situation that I think is getting better for the Seahawks almost exclusively because of Carlos Dunlap. I think Rasheem Green will start to get better as the season goes on. He'll just be healthier. I think LJ Collier is starting to turn a corner a little bit, so maybe we'll get a little bit more out of him too, potentially. Darrell Taylor, I'm not counting on for much, but maybe there's something there too. Damon Harrison, officially activated. He is on the active roster. He is not a practice squad player anymore. He's more of a run stuffer than a pass rusher, but anytime you have huge, massive human beings lining up somewhat close to a quarterback, there's a chance that they fall into him. There's a chance he could bring him down. Jaron Reed is a fantastic pass rusher as an interior defensive lineman, and having another big body next to him, Poona Ford has been fantastic, but having Harrison in that mix as well, all that does is force more offensive linemen to pay attention, which could free up a Reed or free up a Greene or a Dunlap or a Collier to actually get around the edge and get to the quarterback. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this team's pass rush going forward. I'm not saying that they're going to be a top 10 in the league, but they could finish somewhere around the middle for the rest of the season, and that might be enough, especially when you look at their schedule. Their next 4 games: Monday night They have the Philadelphia Eagles. Then they have the New York Jets. Then they have the New York Giants. Then they have the Washington football team. Not only is it a big old East Coast party for the Seattle Seahawks, it is also 4 not very good teams. I mean, this 3-1 would be a disappointment out of this trio of teams. At this point, with the way the Seahawks played last against the Arizona on Thursday, this should be 4 wins. Seahawks win these 4 games. They're 11-3. Remember the panic? Remember that panic that we all felt at this time last week? This team should be 11-3 in a month. Now, the problem is 11-3 is not necessarily a guaranteed first place. It's not even guaranteed a playoff spot. It's probably like the 5th or the 6th seed in the NFC. And that's terrifying. But the Seahawks, they have their 3 losses. They can't take those back. All they can do now is win out. And they got 4 games right now that should put them in a good spot to be 11-3. And they got, they'll get the Rams again. They got to win that one. They'll get the 49ers again. They got to win that one. But it's doable. 13-3 is not out of the question for this football team. And 13-3 will win them the NFC West. And then all of a sudden you're looking at a team that's in a really good spot in the playoffs, especially if Chris Carson's healthy, if Shaquille Griffin is healthy, if Quentin Dunbar is fully healthy, if Rashad Penny's back. There's a lot of things. They probably won't have Greg Olsen. I said I was going to touch on that, and we're running low on time. Greg Olsen was placed on the injured reserve with a left foot injury. It sounds like he's out 4 to 6 weeks. There was some maybe optimism he's coming back. I doubt it. I think we've seen the last of Greg Olsen in a Seattle Seahawks uniform. You can argue that it was not a worthwhile signing. 23 receptions, 244 yards, 1 touchdown, good veteran leadership, seemed to be reliable when they threw him the ball. I don't mind it. It sucks that he got hurt. He's a good human, and I think was signed to be injury insurance for Will Dissly. That worked out for the first 11 weeks of the season for a guy at his age. I think that's kind of the best that you can expect. And Will Dissly is still healthy, so we got that going for us. And Jacob Hollister has looked good. So I think this team's in a pretty good spot right now. They got a nice long break, which is always good. Next time that we speak, the Seahawks will be in the middle of a football game. So we'll have to kind of address that after the game. We'll probably give you some in-game updates as we go on. But that's going to be it for me today. Thank you so much to all of you who tuned in. You can find this on the Worldwide Sports Radio Network website and their app. There will also be posts to these videos of these chats on YouTube, and I will post them on my social media at Andy Patton PNW. Thank you again. Look forward to talking to you all next week.
It's the Worldwide Sports Radio Network.